In this video, I'm going to show you how I crushed my 2400 rated International Master opponent in just 14 moves, and how this positional pawn sacrifice with pawn to d5 led to them resigning in just 9 moves. But let's rewind all the way back to the very beginning, because we started with pawn to d4. They played knight to f6, which is the most common move in the position, and then we go pawn to c4. The idea is that we want to try and control all of these central squares because black hasn't put any of their own pawns in the center. After this, they go e6, which is one of the most common moves once again. We go knight to f3, anti-Nimzo Indian. We don't want to play knight to c3 and allow bishop to b4, but instead I'm going for a kingside fianchetto and then probably castles kingside. They go pawn to b6, another very common approach. This is known as the Queen's Indian defense. Basically, black wants to put their bishop on b7, trying to put a knight on e4, potentially play pawn to f5, and all in all, they want to get really good control of this central e4 square. So we go g3, they play bishop to b7, we go bishop to g2, and now they play pawn to c5. This move is a little bit more rare, but I have a really nasty trick that I'd actually just done a little bit of work on last week, and that move is pawn to d5. This is a positional pawn sacrifice. We're giving up the pawn, and I'll explain the reason why. After we play d5, they capture it, we capture back, and they have to capture with the bishop. The reason is if they capture with the knight, then we will just play a move like knight to h4. We will now have an attack on their knight. The reason knight to e5 doesn't work, by the way, is because they would have knight to e3, which attacks our queen and also the bishop. Meanwhile, after knight to h4, if they try to go knight to e3 once again, then we can actually just capture that knight, and our bishop is already defended on g2, so we would just be winning a piece and winning the game. So that's worth keeping an eye on. We'll see knight to h4 comes up once again in this game, actually. But they pretty much have to take this pawn with the bishop, because if you just try and continue developing, we'll play something like knight c3, e4 castles. This bishop is completely walled out, and white has a much better game with an eventual pawn to e5 breakthrough. So rather than all of that, they have to take it with the bishop, which they do, but now we get the initiative with knight to c3. This is an immediate attack on the bishop, forcing it back either to c6 or to b7. They opt to put it on c6 because on b7 the bishop's undefended, and maybe there'll be some nasty discoveries where we can eventually win the bishop and also win the rook. But from here, you'll see the key idea in this opening, which is that we want to play the move pawn to e4, which controls this d5 square. That's why we sacrificed on d5, so we can prevent black from ever putting their own pawn on d5. If we were to play a bad move here like e3, passive move, or maybe something more logical, let's say castles, then black can immediately play the move pawn to d5 and is doing pretty nicely with this big center. Engine says it's inaccurate because we might have some tricks here with knight to e5, but this is the main concept. We don't want to allow black to achieve this. So instead of that, I go e4. Point is that black still can't really take this pawn here, because then after knight takes on e4, bishop takes on e4, we can go queen e2, and on queen e7, we can just castle, bring our rook to the center, and black comes under some immediate pressure. For example, if they go d5, then we can already go rook to e1. Let's say they try g6 to keep on developing. They're already in huge trouble after something like knight to g5 attacking the bishop here. Let's say they trade bishops. We can play queen to b5 check now, and the queen is pinned to the king, and they will lose the game. And another example, if we go knight to g5 and they try to defend with pawn to f4, very simple, pawn to f3, exploiting the same old tactics. They cannot move the bishop away because then we play queen to b5, and then we once again just win a piece and win the game. So this pawn can't really be captured because they will come under a very quick central pin. So instead of that, they just want to play pawn to d6 because they want to stop pawn to e5. If they played bishop e7, then e5 can get a bit nasty. You don't want to put the knight back on its starting square. You also can't put the knight here because it's guarded twice. So you sort of have to put the knight on e4. But then in this position, we can play knight to d5, now intercepting the defense of the knight. And eventually, we're just going to castle, bring a rook to the center, and this knight doesn't really have any squares to retreat to. Woo, some crazy arrows there. But as you can see, all of the squares are pretty well defended by either our piece, like our knight and bishop here, or our pawn, so this knight really doesn't have a good way home. And if they ever have to give up the light squared bishop, then our bishop here is going to be an absolute beast. So once again, they play d6, preventing e5. All their moves are making sense so far. we castle, they play bishop to e7, and now in this position there's only one good move for white here that maintains the advantage and keeps up the pressure, and that move is knight to h4. The idea behind knight to h4 is that we want to put the knight on f5 and start pressuring all of these pieces here, specifically this d6 pawn, which can come under a lot of pressure with the bishop coming out to f4. And if they go pawn to g6, then we can go bishop to h6, preventing the king from castling. Only move here to try and play on would be something like bishop to f8 to try and make some progress. But after bishop takes on f8, things get very nasty, because if you take with the king, we have pawn to e5, attacking the knight, unleashing the bishop, and you cannot take because we take the queen. So this would be getting very, very sketchy for black. The engine is suggesting knight to e8, which is not a move that you like to see. Here, white would have a big initiative, can maybe even continue with something like e6, just trying to press down the position, and would have a nice game. Knight can access the center, rook's coming to the middle, black is super underdeveloped and has a vulnerable king. Meanwhile, if you take with the rook, it's even worse, because we play rook to e1 and then e5 is coming all the same, and the king is under fire. So instead of that, my opponent just opts to castle the king. We continue with knight to f5, now pressuring these pieces as explained before. Our moves that we want to play now are things like rook e1, bishop to f4, put more pressure on this pawn, threaten e5. And something really crucial that you should notice is that this knight has to remain defending the bishop, because the pawn is no longer on d7. For example, if the knight goes to d7, then we might even have pawn to e5. Not quite here because the knight defends the bishop, but let's say that we reinforce that move with pawn to f4 and they just go rook to e8. Now e5 is actually pretty menacing, because after bishop takes on g2, we can play ef6, attacking the bishop here and also attacking this bishop. And if you take my rook, then I will just take on e7 with the pawn. Now attacking your queen, queen has to move somewhere, let's say queen c7. Could even keep up the pressure here and then take the bishop. And white would have a lovely position here. Two pieces for the rook, dominant pawn over here, d6 pawn very vulnerable, passive pieces, and white would be winning the game. As you can see, engine gives +4 evaluation. But instead of that, my opponent plays rook to e8. I think this move made a lot of sense. They want to play bishop to f8 to get out of this e5, e takes on f6 threat. So I just continue developing normally with rook to e1. I want to play bishop to f4. I want to put pressure on this pawn here. But now my international master opponent, 2400, just blunders the game with this move, knight to a6. Now, why is this a blunder? You should all be able to spot it. As mentioned earlier, of course, it's pawn to e5. Now this bishop is opened up. We're attacking the knight over here. If they take the bishop, once again, we take the knight. This attacks the bishop on e7. Be very careful, by the way. If we were to capture the bishop first, saying this looks like an improvement, then actually they could play queen takes on e7, and after e5, they can just play bishop takes on g2, and there's no taking in between, because actually it's black who would have the center file, and we would just lose the game. But of course, after giving it a little bit of a think and being quite surprised, to be honest, that my opponent blundered this, I did play pawn to e5 after 30 seconds or so, attacking the knight, of course, attacking the bishop. If you move the knight out of the way, the bishop just drops off the board. I mean, d6 is falling, e7 is vulnerable. We've got pins here, the rook's under fire. Let's say you go rook to c8. There's even some nasty queen g4 moves, just attacking the pawn. Let's say bishop f8. Let's look at this. Knight h6, king h8, knight f7. That is absolutely brutal stuff. So all in all, nice, short and sweet victory with this positional pawn sacrifice, pawn to d5. If you were wondering what black should do, bishop to f8 is probably the way to go, but then I would just go bishop to f4. There's some serious pressure on this pawn here. You can now go knight to a6, trying to go to c7, because now e5, there's bishop g2, takes on f6, but there's no bishop that we're attacking in between, which means that you can just like trade rooks, for example. And even moving the bishop back to b7 isn't so bad, although white's still much better after taking here. Actually, the engine gives queen takes on f6, which attacks the knight. I didn't see this during the game, but I was not going to go for this pawn to e5. Probably just something simple like queen d2, bring the rook to the center, and eventually we will cash in this pawn on d6 with a nice development advantage, extra pawn in the center, and black's pieces are super scattered. White would have a nice game. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Keep that pawn to d5 positional sacrifice in mind, and hopefully using that concept, you can get some really nice opening positions in your own games. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you all in another one. Bye!